Welcome to Her Remarkable History. Remember, to support our channel, please subscribe. Breaking into the tomb of the Tudors. The most notorious and shocking royal family to rule over England was the Tudors. The Tudor monarchs, despite only ruling for just over a century, would change the face of the country forever, with a huge alteration to religion being brought into the nation. The Tudor times were a time of bloodshed and execution, with some of the most high-profile members of society being brutally killed in the name of the king's justice. Henry VIII executed 2 of his own wives inside the Tower of London, and some of his closest friends would also meet their maker on Tower Hill. But Mary I, Henry's daughter, would also instigate a reign of terror in which many were burned at the stake. But after the death of Elizabeth I in 1603, the Tudor era came to an abrupt end. Previous monarchs had envisioned that the House of Tudor would remain on the throne for centuries after. Most of the Tudor monarchs were buried inside of Westminster Abbey, and the only real outlier in this was King Henry VIII, who was buried at St George's Chapel in Windsor Castle. But in the centuries after, the tombs of the Tudor monarchs were opened and broken into by a curious Dean of Westminster Abbey, who found out some remarkable secrets. The first foundation stone of Henry VII's New Lady Chapel at Westminster Abbey was put in place on the 24th of January 1503, and 2 old chapels were demolished to make way for a huge and magnificent royal mausoleum. Henry VII would envision that his family and descendants would be buried around him, and that this new chapel would be the resting place of kings for centuries to come. However, a month later, Henry VII's wife, Elizabeth of York, died of childbirth at the Tower of London on her 37th birthday. The mausoleum was no way near complete, so Elizabeth was then interred inside of the abbey. Her body would later be reinterred next to her husband's once everything was completed. But by the time Henry VII died, the chapel was no way near completion, and his body was held at St Paul's before being brought to Westminster. The coffin was covered in black velvet, emblazoned with a white satin cross, and it was lowered into a cavernous vault. Over the next century, further Tudor queens and kings would be interred inside of the abbey. Edward VI, the son and heir of Henry VIII, following his early death, was buried there, as was Mary I, or Bloody Mary, and Elizabeth I. Westminster Abbey, and especially near the Lady Chapel, would also house the remains of Margaret Beaufort, and later Mary Queen of Scots. But then, centuries later, the Dean of Westminster, Stanley, would break into the Tudor vaults, and he would find great treasures, intrigue and information regarding the burials of the Tudors. Dean Stanley and his team initially began to dig west of the Henry VII and Elizabeth of York monument, in an area which was believed to contain the tomb of Edward VI. They came across a shallow vault containing 1 lead coffin, and its appearance was described as deformed as well as wasted by long corrosion and perhaps by having been examined before. This means that someone before had broken into the tomb of the young Tudor king. This narrow vault was measured as 7.5 foot long and 2.5 foot wide. There was no other coffin found. Also found was the remains of the Los Torregiano altar, which once sat in front of the west end of the Henry VII and Elizabeth of York's memorial. At the time, the altar was considered priceless, and it's believed it was placed in Edward's tomb to protect it from the English Civil War and destruction by Puritans. Also, under the coffin was debris, and the wooden case had been part cleared away, but at the lower end, the coffin plate of the king was loose and unsoldered and had been curled up. It said on it, "Edward VI, by the grace of God, King of England, France and Ireland, defender of the faith, and on earth under Christ supreme head of the churches of England and Ireland, and he migrated from this life on the 6th day of July in the evening at the 8th hour in the year of our Lord, 1553, and in the 7th year of his reign, and the 16th year of his age. The sad death of Edward VI, Henry VIII's heir and son, was recorded as occurring at 8 p.m. on the 6th of July 1553. The plate was then placed back into the grave, but the artwork was then placed back onto its original position. At the time, Dean Stanley wasn't looking necessarily for a Tudor king, but a Stuart one, and the remains of King James I. He looked in every possible other place in the abbey, but then he came across the tomb at the head of the chapel. He would break into the vault of the first Tudor monarchs, Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. It was said in the abbey's register that James I was buried alongside the two monarchs, but this was rejected. At the time, there was no evidence of the floor being disturbed, and it was believed at the time that the founders of the Tudor dynasty had been left for centuries. Dean Stanley then began to open up a narrow space close to the vault of Edward VI, and immediately they realised this earth had been disturbed before. As the earth was cleared, they found a stone step and further brickwork which opened up the entrance to the tomb which had not been opened in almost 400 years. Arthur Stanley said, "It was with a feeling of breathless anxiety amounting to solemn awe, which caused the humblest of workmen employed to whisper in bated breath, as the small opening of the apex of the arch admitted the first glimpse into the mysterious secret which had hereunto eluded this long search. They shone a light, and they managed to reveal 3 coffins. 2 of them were dark and grey with age, but the third was brighter and newer. The darker ones were laid, and the newer was still in its wooden case, and it had an inscription on the lid. To enter the tomb, Stanley and his workmen continued to reveal the loose brickwork, which was very small. They measured the vault as being 8 foot 10 inches long and 5 foot wide and 4.5 foot high. Stanley said that when the vault was opened, he got a deadly chill, but there, lying on the north side, was the elusive James I's coffin. But interestingly, the Stuart king was buried next to Elizabeth of York and Henry VII, and it was deemed fit to place his remains with the founders of the Tudor dynasty. Both of the Tudor monarchs' coffins were lead, and the whole of the wood casing had been removed before. This had been done deliberately during James I's interment to make space for the Stuart king's coffin. Each Tudor coffin was shaped at the head and shoulders, and it ran down. Elizabeth's was marked with a Maltese cross, and to her right was Henry VII, her husband, and an inscription plate read, "Here lies Henry VII, King of England, France and Ireland, who died the 21st day of April in the 24th year of his reign, and the year of our Lord 1509. Inside of the vault there were burial urns found, and also further treasures, including silk, but also graffiti markings where someone else had been inside of the vault. Etched onto the vault and the lead was John Ware, and the initials EC, and the date 1645, the year that James I was interred into the vault. The vault was yet again closed, and Dean Arthur Stanley had got what he wanted. But there were 2 more Tudor monarchs buried inside of Westminster Abbey, those being Mary I and Elizabeth I. Initially, Elizabeth's body had been deposited in the vault occupied by Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, but in 1607 her coffin was moved to the same location as Bloody Mary's, her half-sister. The removal of the Queen's body cost 46 shillings and 4 pence, and a magnificent monument to her was made by James I. Stanley would survey the burial of Elizabeth and Mary, and he would come across the narrow vault containing 2 coffins. Elizabeth was placed on top of Mary. He said there was no disorder or decay, except the centering wood, and that the uppermost coffin had fallen in, and some of the sides were crumbling, which had drawn away part of the decaying lid. No coffin plate were present, but there was a Tudor rose carved, which had the initials ER carved beneath the year 1603. This was Elizabeth I's coffin, and she had been laid directly on the mortal remains of her half-sister Mary I. which was unique, but symbolised her importance over her half-sister. With this, Arthur Stanley, the Dean of Westminster, had broken in and examined all of the Tudor tombs containing monarchs inside of the abbey. There were more Tudors buried inside of the abbey, and there were also important figures such as Anne of Cleves who were buried there. But the curious Dean had been given permission to do this work by Queen Victoria, and at the time there was a rebirth in intrigue into the past and in history, and in particular the Tudors. It's likely that he would have invited visitors into the abbey to see the burial places of these monarchs, and today the vaults containing these Tudors still remain in place. It's believed that this was the last time that the burials were disturbed, and that the secret Tudor vaults of Westminster Abbey have remained sealed since then. Thank you for watching, and to support, please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.